With the release of Shadow Generations, I went ahead and updated my Sonic tier list, which I presented in my original tier list video. After a little more thought and evaluation, I wanted to re-explain some of the rankings, as I feel they weren't all conveyed very well in the original video, while also going over some new additions to the list, including Shadow Gens. As said before, this list is not exclusively about story/writing, but primarily how much each game's artistic direction resonates with me, while also going over some secondary things that are significant to me that do relate to the story or characters. This does not include every single game in the Sonic series, but just a select few within the Adventure era, Griffith era, and the 2010s games. S means I love it. A means I like it. B means it's not bad. C means it's decent but could be better. And D means it's just not it for me. While a plus means it's halfway to the next grade. Once again, I should clarify that D does not mean I hate whatever is in that category. It simply just means it's not my cup of tea. It either had nothing that stood with me, or whatever did was overshadowed by everything else. Let it be said that I am not someone who gets angry or hateful towards things like movies and games, and that this is merely just me casually expressing my own feelings. It is not in any way meant to be presented as fact. Lastly, forgive me if I sound like I'm nitpicking in some areas or not much is said. These explanations are not full rundowns, but just some things that I can cite about them off the top of my head as I try my best to detail them. Sometimes I also simply just don't have much to say. I want to clarify something that I feel may have also been misconstrued after having a previous discussion with somebody a few months ago. I corrected this in the description of my media absorption video. However, I'm pretty sure no one saw it because I edited it at the last minute after the view count had already effectively stopped. I did briefly mention this in the original tier list video, but I want to further emphasize that when talking about artistic direction, I was never saying that I care about it more than story, just that I'm not a stickler about a 10 out of 10 story, as in I don't need every part of it to line up perfectly. I'm not that serious about digging into every piece of a story and its characters like most other people on social media. I'm more basic in that my only concern with story/writing is that I just need to be able to follow the overall story and for there to be a clear narrative. That could fall flat if the artistic direction doesn't sit with me, or inversely, the artistic direction could fall flat if I personally don't understand the story. Everything I've talked about on this channel in regards to the things I like their stories. They made enough sense to me. That's what allows me to appreciate the other aspects in the first place. Basically, the two elements do go hand in hand. I'm just not one of those people who gets really mad or upset at a story or script for not having certain things in it. Entertainment isn't that serious for me, and I'm not really part of that culture for that reason. I was never trying to say that artistic direction or artistry or whatever you might call it is more important. It's just something I'm very passionate about. It's the first thing my brain notices about a piece of content. But that doesn't mean it can't lose its effect if I don't understand the story. It's a very simple concept. Lastly, I also want to make it clear that none of the things I talk about are necessarily my quote-unquote takes. All these videos are me expressing what it is I naturally, unconsciously trend towards. I can't control what does or doesn't appeal to me, or how I get that appeal. It's not something I consciously make up in my mind. It just is. I just see something, and it either sparks an emotion in me, or it doesn't. In other words, this is just how my brain works. Now, with all that being said, let's get into it. In S tier, I have Sonic 06. Now look, I want to say first and foremost that I know people ridicule this game not only for being broken, but for the story having holes and continuity issues. I get it. But personally, they don't anger or upset me. In a perfect world, would I change them, and are there things I would certainly like to change? Yes. But they don't hinder my overall enjoyment. I personally never even had a problem following the story. It made enough sense to me, and I have enough interest in it. Even so, what I love about this game is purely the direction it was going for, even if the end result wasn't completely successful. Out of all the Sonic games, this one is the most cinematically appealing to me. It feels like Sega's version of Kingdom Hearts, and I love that feel of it. From the designs of the characters and environments, to the action, the way it's structured, to Mephiles as a villain, the music, to the beautiful cinematics. It honestly feels like a movie. While not my first introduction to Sonic, this game is what cemented my interest in the series. If I were to lay out any major reservations I have with the game that did stand out to me, it's just Sonic's story and screen time. As I was watching through it, it really felt more like a Shadow and Silver game despite Sonic being the titular character. He spent most of his time just running off with Elise and saving her over and over, and I feel like he was underutilized. I'd prefer if Eggman didn't take the role of Bowser and kidnap Elise 100 times, while Elise herself got to do more. It also would have been nice if Sonic had actually interacted with Mephiles as well like the others had. There's also the voice direction, which admittedly was off at some points, and of course the animation of the in-game cutscenes was wonky, but obviously that's the result of the game being rushed, and the latter is more of a technical issue than a stylistic one. Lastly, I would have altered the kiss scene, not because I'm disgusted by it like everyone else, but simply because I feel a tear would have been much more poetic and really make everything come full circle, considering it was a tear that started this whole mess. I also have to say that I do think it's a bit odd that Sonic is shown as seemingly having feelings for Elise, as I never really saw him as the romantic type. Not to mention I always felt him and Amy were supposed to have that bond deep down. So that is one other thing I would alter. But all in all, I would just love to see another Sonic game take this direction and for it to be given another chance. It's my favorite incarnation of the series. In A tier I have Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow the Hedgehog, and the Sonic Riders duology. I feel much the same way with Adventure 2 as I do with 06. Adventure 2, while not having the Kingdom Hearts movie element to it, similarly has that cinematic feel as far as the way it's structured, the extensive story, and the music. Some things I like about it are the involvement of the government and the humans, Eggman's more cunning and calculative demeanor, and the game's overall more rad nature. From the covers to Knuckles' hip-hop tracks.
Let's take a dive in aquatic mind. Once was a cold pit, but now it's a water ride. Makes you wanna sit back, enjoy the life, and do things you like doing, get to shine. It's sure beats fighting with the foes all the time, but I gotta do it, they always stay out of line.
My only reservations with this game, I would say, and this is more technical than stylistic, is just the way it's animated and the way characters speak over each other, which makes those aspects a little hard to appreciate, but not by a wide margin. And I guess not all of the music hits me as much either. Particularly, I've never cared that much for Live and Learn and Crush 40 as a whole, but they don't necessarily bring it down for me that much. As for Shadow, many people also ridicule this game for being too edgy. And I would agree that there are definitely some things about this game that make it appear that way, from the excessive cursing to the opening intro to some of the music. However, when you actually take a look at this game, it's really not that different from Adventure 2, and isn't as edgy as it makes itself appear. And I think it actually serves as a pretty nice continuation of Shadow's story, of which the YouTuber Pariah 695 breaks down pretty well. I don't mind the inclusion of the Black Arms, and Black Doom is a fine villain to me. Personally, I love this game's somewhat darker style in conjunction with the other things I've mentioned. It's not like Shadow didn't already have some of that in Adventure 2. This game just takes it further, and like 06 it enhances that same movie feel in the form of the same beautiful CG cinematics. Another major thing I really love about this game is its music. Ever since I discovered its unused tracks a year or so ago, it upped my attraction to this game and really changed the way I look at it. The game has my favorite score in the series next to 06's tracks, and to me they just really give the game a lot of soul. They're just really unique and don't sound like tracks you'd hear in a video game. They may not have been used, but they were only dropped due to issues with the bands, and that's what makes me still see them as part of the game.
Take all of me.
And lastly, what I love about Riders is how swag they are compared to other Sonic games. Sonic's always had a swag vibe to him, but these games really put an emphasis on that and present it in a way that's more of a futuristic kind of funk. I love the concept of extreme gears, and it's much cooler for Sonic than a standard kart racer. And like the previous games, it's got the added major bonus of cinematics that just further highlight that. The only thing I have to say about this game in regards to the characters is probably Jet's voice. I think he just sounds too much like a nerd in contrast to his design. I kinda wish he had a different voice. But besides that, the games are just really cool. Overall, all of these games are reduced to A tier simply for the fact that they just don't resonate with me as much as 06 and nothing more than that. However, all of these games are my top favorites within the series. In B tier, I have Heroes and Secret Rings, with Heroes having a B-. Honestly, I never had a strong attachment to Heroes, even when I watched it as a kid. It's in the same camp as Spider-Man 2002, where it has some of those elements that I like, but it's just too cheesy for my taste. A lot of the dialogue in particular was just really corny, and the story just wasn't really that interesting for me. I wish for one thing that Shadow's return was a bigger deal, considering how impactful his sacrifice was, even for Sonic. You'd think Sonic would be just a little more appalled. The game as a whole just felt really kiddie in contrast to the other games. I know Sonic is aimed towards kids, but there's a difference between being aimed for kids and then being kiddie, which the other games clearly weren't trying to be. It felt like it should have been more of a non-canon, spin-off party game if anything else. But despite that, I still give it a B- because honestly, I really like a lot of the music. And it still has a bit of that adventure feel amidst all the cheesiness. It's just about teetering on a C grade. Secret Rings I give a solid B. I think I've just never been that attached to the storybook style, to be honest, or really the concept of Sonic being pulled into a fantasy book world as a whole. However, I do think this game is still really cool and continues Sonic's badassery and swagger in a way that appeals to me to a fair degree. For one thing, I love most of the music, the intro cutscene, and Sonic's transformation into Darkspine Sonic. The ending cutscene is also pretty beautiful and reminds me of the scenes with Sonic and Elise. In C tier is Unleashed, Black Knight, Frontiers, and Shadow Generations, with a C+ for Shadow Gens. Like most other Sonic fans, there are quite a few things I like about Unleashed. I think it has a great opening cutscene. I love tracks like Windmill Isle, Cool Edge, Endless Possibilities, and Dear My Friend. It has my second favorite supersonic transformation behind 06. I think this game has the best in-game cutscenes, and this game has my favorite depiction of Sonic's character next to X-Sonic. I like how his cockiness is more mild and he's more mellowed out and mature, just like in 06. I've always been more fond of that personality type for him, rather than when he's constantly witty and kind of bratty even. The rest of the game, however, feels like a beta version of the 2010s games. For starters, the humans look more like WiiWare characters this time around, contrast to how they appeared in previous games. There's more Hanna-Barbera-esque sound effects coupled with more kiddie humor.
If I was that hungry, I don't know how long I would last. I'd rather be dead.
We're not telling you anything!
Eggman is more of a joke in this game and even has a prototype Orbot by his side that acts like the standard comedic evil assistant. And most of the score felt more whimsical and just wasn't doing it for me. When you compare this game to the previous entries, it really starts to stick out. Besides all of that, I'm also just not a huge fan of Werehog Sonic. The transformation was admittedly cool, but the form as a whole just feels kind of, I don't know, generic, I guess? I used to love this game a lot as a kid, but having looked back at it, it's gone down for me. Black Knight is the same as Secret Rings in that I'm just not too attached to the storybook style and the premise. In general, I don't think I'm that interested in a medieval-esque Sonic, and have less interest in that than the Arabian Nights, which was at least still kinda cool to me. Besides that, I feel this game also has just a bit more whimsicalness to it, similarly to Unleashed as far as some of the humor and most of the score. Lastly, I'm just not too fond of Sonic's character in this game. Like I said, I prefer him more when his cockiness and wittiness is mild. In this game, it feels amplified, and he acts closer to Roger's Sonic, where he's more bratty most of the time and talks a lot. Regardless, it still carries some of the previous elements, and even though I don't care too much for Crush 40, I like the ending song Live Life. As for Frontiers, while many Sonic fans consider it the series' return to form, it's not quite there for me. I'll say firstly that there are things I like about it. I like the entire Knuckles prologue animation, and feel that that is one thing that does recapture the essence of before. I like the Titan battles, the Titans themselves, and the overall combat. Particularly, I like how Sonic's speed is emphasized more unlike previous games, which is something I always wanted to see. Unlike other modern games, I do like most of the music this time around, with my favorites being Flowing, Vandalize, Dear Father, and maybe If. And yes, I do feel that the characters for the most part act like their old selves again. I also really love Cybersonic's transformation scene in the Japanese dub of the game. Junichi just really kills it. What makes this game lacking for me isn't the fact that it isn't past the colorful era of the 2010s games, but has to do with the fact that most of it kind of just feels like a fan game. Not from what I assume is a lower budget in regards to the cutscenes, but really the way the game is as a whole, from the score, to its structure, the dialogue, and I suppose even somewhat the story. For one thing, the game feels like it's more focused on trying to course correct, rather than making an original story. The game is filled with callbacks and references, of which most I feel are unnecessary. I like that they're trying to make the games more connected, and some of the callbacks make sense, but a lot of them are pretty random to me, and come off as key jangling, like it's a bit excessive and doesn't feel natural. The game as a whole feels like it retreads a lot of the same waters in a way that I guess doesn't feel entirely original. One major thing I should also point out is the voices. Personally, with the exception of Tails, the 2010s cast has just never grown on me. I've always preferred the X cast, even as a kid who was new to Sonic in the 2010s, as I just naturally like their voices the most. It has nothing to do with their talents as voice actors or the voice direction, but just the voices by themselves. They try to sound more serious in this game, but it just doesn't work for me. Amy sounds too old. Knuckles, I'm just not feeling. And Sonic especially isn't any better, and is now much too deep for me. He sounds less like Sonic and more like Chris Redfield. Even Eggman sounds a little off, but that might just be due to age. It's hard to feel for them when the voices are so different, and that aspect is just always going to be a point of contention for me in the modern games. And then admittedly, I am quite turned off by the cutscenes and the models of the characters. It's just kind of stale for me, and looks more like a slightly improved version of Forces, especially with the black borders and subtitles, which just add to it feeling more like a fan game. While they weren't the entire reason for my attachment towards the 2000s games, it is a shame that the game doesn't feature any CGI cutscenes. It doesn't necessarily bring the game down, but it certainly may have boosted my feelings for the game a bit and add a bit more of a movie feel like before. But even then, I would have been fine if all the cutscenes were more like Unleashed's cutscenes. Lastly, while I liked more of the music this time around, there's also just quite a bit I didn't care for. Particularly most of the Titan themes as well as the main theme, and the game's overall score. I liked parts of the Titan themes after listening to them properly, but as a whole they just don't hit me the same. I'm not a fan of metal, and there's just too much screaming for my taste. Overall, it's not that cinematically appealing. Essentially, if I were to describe Frontiers in comparison to the previous games, it feels more like an anime-inspired cartoon rather than an actual anime. If the earlier games are Japanese with a Western influence, then I'd say this feels Western with a Japanese influence. It just feels like a new team's attempt at trying hard to imitate another's work, rather than legitimately being like that piece. I just don't get that same spark as before. It has some of the elements, but it's lacking in others. Now, I already discussed in depth how I feel towards Shadowgens, including Dark Beginnings, in a separate video dedicated to that game, so I'll just briefly summarize it here. This game is certainly a step up from Frontiers. One major thing I really like is this game's cutscenes. To me, it's the best in-game cutscenes Sonic games have ever had, and these are cutscenes that I definitely don't mind for an entire game. I like most of the game's score and how it reuses scores from past games, which was a really nice touch. I like how they've treated the humans, and the fact that they've been brought back at all. I'm glad they dropped the Unleashed designs and went back to their Shadow the Hedgehog / storybook designs, save for Maria. It actually kind of looks like a mix between 06's realism and those games' semi-anime / cartooniness. I think Shadow's Doom mutations is a really neat concept, and the wing form especially is cool. Lastly, Kirk's Shadow has grown on me just a little bit thanks to the altered voice direction. And of course, above all, I like the fact that they're tying back to Shadow 05 at all, which I never thought they would do. My only major reservation with this game isn't actually its artistic direction, but rather purely the story. With the way Dark Beginnings was, it gave the impression that the game was going to expand on Generation's story and give us insight into unanswered things like what the Time Eater is, how white space works, and things like that. But instead, the game is just as thrown together as the original. A lot of things just happen without any rhyme or reason, and there's no established rules or explanations. Quite a bit of things aren't properly elaborated on. Really basic things that I feel should have been established first, like how Black Doom got a new body, or how Sonic and Co. didn't see the big eye in the sky despite clearly being in the same hub world. And then there are things that I feel were glossed over too quickly, like Shadow and Maria's reunion, who Shadow clearly still cares for deeply despite the events of Shadow 05. Adding to that, I really didn't like Mephiles' inclusion in this game. Ignoring his new voice, which I saw coming from a mile away, I'm not a fan of how he's treated like just another villain of the week, and how the restoration of the 06 timeline itself is glossed over after everything that happened in that game. Not only do I feel that Mephiles is one of the Sonic series' most dangerous villains, but I feel it's a pretty significant contrivance to not talk about the 06 timeline being restored when resetting it was such a big deal. I just feel like out of everything in the campaign it would make the most sense to touch on. But instead it's relegated to a simple fan service boss fight, and it's disappointing. Not at all how I'd imagine Mephiles' comeback to be. Essentially, the game is more of an encyclopedia for Shadow and promotion for Sonic 3, more than it is a serious continuation of Shadow's story, and I'm disappointed that they didn't try to make it more interesting and expand on the original game rather than continuing with Generation's strict fan service over story theme. Because besides that, it has the structure and most of the cinematic appeal. All it's missing is the proper story. But perhaps it has to do with the fact that they had to tie it to Generations, in which it's reasonable to assume that maybe that hindered a few things, what with the original game being so simplistic in of itself. But I kind of doubt that. If it had a longer, more thought-out story, then I could see it being a solid B or B+. Finally, there's D tier, which includes pretty much every game from 2010 to 2019, starting with Freeriders and ending with Team Sonic Racing. Now, it should be said that when it comes to a shared universe, I don't mind a little diversity in terms of artistic direction. I don't need everything to be exactly one for one. However, these games are changed so drastically that it doesn't even feel like the same universe anymore. As is well known, ever since the backlash of the 2000s games, the games following Black Knight pretty much dropped everything and completely regressed Sonic into what's the equivalent of a Saturday morning cartoon. Sonic acts more like Jaleel White's iteration. Shadow went from a reclusive anti-hero to a legitimate edgelord. Eggman is a total joke with the standard goofball henchman. the humans are totally absent. The rest of the cast are background characters. The humor is written for 5-year-olds, and the stories are more or less completely generic. More glaring than that, and further exacerbating this, the artistic direction has shifted dramatically, and there isn't an ounce of what initially drew me into the series. Everything is vibrantly colorful, the scores are completely whimsical and forgettable, real music artists stopped being featured, there's almost zero CG cutscenes, and what's there isn't at all as cinematically appealing, and the whole cinematic structure is gone with the generic theming of the stories. Overall, it went back to how the Genesis games were, only far cornier. Like even CD was cooler than these games. Sonic 3 even. Definitely my least favorite games in the series, and that's coming from someone who grew up during this era. The only game I still can't evaluate my feelings towards properly is Sonic Adventure 1. The thing that makes it hard to appreciate this game's artistic direction and story in full is its technical aspects. It's really hard to cop a feel for them when everything is so wonky. It's worse than Adventure 2 in 06, and is just very distracting. Not to mention the voice acting, which sounds off in a lot of parts. I know it was 1999, and that this was their first major leap to 3D apart from 3D Blast. But still, if there was better animation and voice work, then I could see the game being an A or a B. I can see what it was going for past all of the technicalities, and it looks pretty similar to Adventure 2. So there you have it. Honestly, I don't know if I'll ever be as invested in Sonic as I was with the previous games, and if there will ever be another S tier for me. While the games now are taking a new direction and trying to go back to what once was, I feel as though there are some things that for me will just never be quite the same as before. We're only 2 games into this so-called Renaissance era, so we'll just have to continue to wait and see. That being said, thanks for listening, and peace.
It does.